For the latest development, we now joined via Skype by Sami Hamdi, the editor-in-chief of the International Interest, a UK-based international magazine and commentator on Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan and Pakistan politics. Sami, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you for having me.
What exactly are these common concerns that Italy and France have over Libya?
Italy and France ostensibly have the concerns over the presence of foreign forces in Libya, over the scuppering of the UN roadmap towards elections, which, according to France and Italy, would favor Haftar and his forces. They are concerned that what's happening in Libya is a disintegration of this UN roadmap that will mean the cementing of the control of Turkey and Russia on a country in which they both have many interests in. And I think with regards to the catastrophic scenes that we saw in the Libyan political dialogue forum, in which the subject of elections was now up for question, it appeared that on all sides they were rejecting the idea of elections. Neither the government in Tripoli wanted elections and neither did Haftar want elections. It's becoming abundantly clear that all of the progress that's been made with regards to pursuing a political solution is beginning to fall apart. This is not necessarily the primary concern of France and Italy, but where it relates to France and Italy is that the disintegration of the UN roadmap and the breaking apart of the political dialogue favors two parties more than France and Italy. And those two parties are Turkey and Russia, and that's why we've seen Italy and France increasingly become more aligned with regards to their interest in Libya. One of the reasons why we had this talk of mutual concerns.
Now, Libya is set to hold elections in late December. So what's the likelihood of the elections going ahead without a glitch?
I think it's important to stress that none of the Libyan factions actually want elections. It was superimposed on them by the UN process that was imposed by the US after Haftar had essentially failed to take over Tripoli, and the Turks had rushed in and established a military equilibrium. So it's important to stress for anybody listening that the Libyans are being dragged to elections and are not going towards it willingly. And that's the problem here, in that what drove the Libyan parties to agree to the elections in the first place was the threat of force. It was Turkey barging in, it was the US threatening sanctions, it was the Russians and Egyptians threatening to intervene militarily, and this sort of military equilibrium. But since then, the international community has become a bit lax. We've seen that the US has deprioritized Libya. We've seen that the new envoy sent to Libya on behalf of the European Union, Jan Kubis, is not necessarily interested in pressuring Haftar to refrain from using force, but is rather entertaining the prospect of rehabilitating Haftar into the political system, despite the fact that he led the military campaign to overthrow the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. In other words, it's becoming increasingly clear that the focus is on the show of election and not the substance. The focus is on showing the world that Libya is progressing via elections without any focus as to how these elections will unfold or the ramifications for what happens if these elections take place. Because let's remember that in 2014, Libya had elections. The problem was not the absence of elections. The problem was that when the elections took place, the parties that lost refused to recognize the result. They went and blockaded the Supreme Court. They took over the airport in Tripoli, and essentially the country descended into civil war, while, of course, Haftar was embarking on his military operations. In other words, elections in the current environment may actually result in the adverse effect or the opposite effect of what's being intended, in that you create this climate go from a ceasefire in which there's a military equilibrium to an election that nobody recognizes and decides to go to civil war in. And Khalid al-Mishri, one of the most powerful men in Western Libya today, said on Clubhouse, in a meeting on Clubhouse, that if Haftar wins the elections, then we go to war, essentially already acknowledging that he would not recognize those elections. And this is why when we're talking about, directly to your question about whether elections will take place in December, now what's happening is that the lack of international will to force these parties to abide by the political solution and the subsequent willingness of the international community to renegotiate the terms of the political roadmap, in which elections was a key part of it, as well as the Libyan elections openly now campaigning against holding elections, the Prime Minister Dbeiba and Haftar on the other side. Now it's no longer clear. Now it may well be one of two scenarios will unfold. Either elections will be delayed and we continue with the status quo as Haftar tries to militarily secure a more advantageous position, or the US forces elections, steamrolls elections, and we end up in a civil war when the parties don't recognize the results. Because the environment is not conducive to elections, but there's also a lack of an international will to deploy the resources necessary to create that very environment. Instead, what we're seeing is a policy of appeasement. Give Haftar what he wants, give Misrata what it wants, give Zawiya what it wants, give all these various different militias what they want. So we can do this election in a very similar manner to Iraq. Elections take place and the rest doesn't matter, even if there are militias acting with impunity and killing people left, right, center. As long as the world sees there are elections, that's all that matters to us. That's the direction that we're heading in, and that's why now we're going through a very dangerous period in Libya.
Well, Sami, it's quite interesting that you say that there's a lack of international will to ensure that this impasse comes to an end. I mean, remember that previous UN-sponsored peace talks have failed. What then can we expect from next week's UN Security Council to be chaired by France?
I don't think we can expect much. I think we can expect more of the same in terms of rhetoric, in terms of the foreign forces having to leave Libya, in terms of this idea of terrorism and this idea of security language, this idea that there must be a respect for the Libyan will. All of this diplomatic language that in reality doesn't mean anything at all, because what we're seeing unfolding now in Libya is Biden is increasingly focused on China and is trying to negotiate a truce with the Russians, and that's why we're seeing less pressure now on the Wagner group in Libya. This is why we're seeing less pressure on Russians to vacate their military bases. And instead, what we might see in future is a compromise whereby Russia rebrands its presence in Libya, in that we no longer call them mercenaries, but they find some sort of official framework within which to justify their military presence in Libya. Likewise, Biden is in discussion with Turkey for Turkey to oversee U.S. interests, to act as the U.S. bodyguard in the region, whether that's in Libya, whether that's in Afghanistan. And of course, that necessitates the continuing presence of Turkey in Libya. France is livid that these two powers are there and it doesn't have a presence in Libya, and it will continue to try to negotiate its own military presence by negotiating with the various militias on the ground. But my point is that what is becoming abundantly clear is that it's no longer about the elections, it's no longer about the political solution, it's no longer about the Libyans, it's more that Turkey and Russia are in the ascendancy and everybody is trying to adapt to a reality, and nobody is willing to spend the resources necessary to push Russia out, to force Haftar to abide by the political solution. Turkey is already willing to go by the political solution because it's already secured what it wants to secure from Libya. But it's becoming abundantly clear now that what we're seeing in Libya is a sort of attitude whereby we don't care what happens. If we have to split Libya between East and West, let's split between East and West. All we need is stability. If that comes through democracy, great. If it comes through Haftar, great. If it comes through another militia, great. Let's just find a way to end this portfolio and focus on more important issues, which are migration, terrorism, China, and essentially trying to secure the borders and the integrity of the European Union. That's the priority, not Libya. And I think that's now being reflected in the turbulence that we're seeing with regards to the political roadmap.
And where is Libya in all these talks? I mean, where and how do they feature, if at all? Do you believe that there is enough engagement with the people of Libya on the way forward, or are the foreign powers taking on a paternalistic approach to this conflict?
I think the Libyans sold their country in 2011 when they invited NATO to get rid of Gaddafi. I think the moment NATO got involved, Libya went from a revolution to essentially the selling of a country for the sake of freedom, or some twisted concept of freedom that they're enjoying today. This idea that Libyans have the utmost freedom now to do what they wish, to pick up a gun, to go and fight, to go and kill, to go and loot, to go and do as they wish with no impunity, and without any accountability. I think the reality is that there is no country NATO intervened in which it managed to secure the political stability. NATO is not a charity. When it comes in, it expects to be rewarded. When France wasn't rewarded in 2011 and 2012, it decided to support Haftar's coup against the internationally recognized government. When the UAE felt it was not rewarded enough, it supported Haftar. When the US felt it was not rewarded enough, it sat on the fence and watched the Libyans fight one another in a bid essentially to recognize the winner, because it knew the winner would turn up to Washington. The EU was more concerned about the fact that Libya had disintegrated into chaos than any desire to see the Libyans actually express freedom and actually express some sort of democratic tendencies, because it was concerned that in the other free and fair elections in the Arab Spring countries, they had voted for more Islamic tendencies and the EU was very hesitant about it. Macron told Le Grand Continent magazine last year that what we saw in the Arab Spring was regressive tendencies, as he called it, implying that he wasn't happy with how the Arabs had manifested their newfound democracy. So in other words, the Libyans have no agency. France is not interested in empowering the Libyans, neither are the US, neither are the EU. What we're seeing is an international discussion over how to divide Libya into spheres of influence, over who should get access to oil, who should get access to the economy, who should get access to the rebuilding. And Libyans are only important insofar as they act as proxies, insofar as they facilitate that international involvement. And I think it's very poignant that today what we see the government in Tripoli in the West essentially going to international powers and saying, support me, don't do elections, just back me and I promise to give you economic contracts. We're seeing Haftar who's saying, don't do elections, but back me and I promise to look after your interests in Libya. We're seeing no address to the Libyan people, because the reality of the matter is that they don't matter, they're not important, they're not relevant to everything that is unfolding in Libya. That is the tragedy of what we're seeing unfolding before us. That's the tragedy of Libya, and I think the reality is that they're set for decades of chaos until there is some sort of decisive victory or decisive reconciliation that brings the powers together and outs the foreign interest. But I think now what we're seeing in Libya now is that it's going to become a failed state, or a division between East and West, each one representing one international orbit as opposed to the Libyan people. And that's the tragedy of Libya, and that's why it hurts a lot to talk about what's going on there.
And Sami, just speaking of Libya's being set for, a decade of chaos, as you've suggested, what do you think of Libya's unity government, Prime Minister Abdullah Hamid? And what do you think his future is beyond the unity government come December elections?
Abdul Hamid Dbeiba, for the past few years, has always been presenting himself at conferences, at international conferences, as the future Prime Minister of Libya. And Abdul Hamid Dbeiba, when he first took up his position as the head of the unity government this year, the first thing he did was announce a budget that was clearly a 5-year budget, not a 1-year budget. Dbeiba appears to have taken on the position in the belief that he can convince the international powers not to hold elections in December and to give him a full term within which to impose himself on the Libyan political system and establish himself. Dbeiba is clear that his policy is one of appeasement, to give every single party in Libya some sort of slice of the economic cake, whether that's giving positions to Haftar's sons, Haftar of course rejected it, whether that's giving positions to Misrata, to Zawiya, to people in Sabha and the like, to give essentially create positions in government for all the various different factions in order to make them feel like they are part of the government and buy them off by essentially dividing the Libyan economy in a sort of patronage system that Gaddafi did to keep Libya together. But the international community is more set on elections, albeit for their own reasons, not necessarily for the sake of the Libyans. They want to see Libya progress politically. And it appears that with Abdul Hamid Dbeiba, now he's finding his opportunity to navigate this sort of condition of holding elections. Now he's lobbying for a delay in the elections. He's lobbying for a full 5-year term without having to be voted in by the Libyan people. He's clashing with Haftar, who doesn't necessarily want elections but wants himself to be the ruler of Libya. So I think with regards to Dbeiba, I think initially the policy was welcomed of appeasement, of patronage, but it's becoming increasingly clear that there's not enough money to go around. There's not enough of the economy to go around. And the reality is his appeasement policy is now falling short. And what we're seeing now with this constitutional crisis is the Libyans now are increasingly concerned that what they are seeing unfolding before them is actually a power grab and not a caretaker government to guide them to elections.
All right, Sami, great chatting to you. As always, it's a pleasure having you on the show and sharing your analysis on this matter. We do appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right, that is Sami Hamdi. He is the editor-in-chief of the International Interest, a UK-based international magazine, joining us via Zoom.